I truly believe anyone can deadlift 600 pounds, and today I'm going to tell you how. Before we get stuck in, I want you to comment down below what is your max deadlift and what is your deadlift goal. Let's see how much work we have to do to get you to your 600 pound deadlift or to your next milestone. Of course, there are some caveats, but I am talking about the vast majority of people watching this video. I am talking about men for 600 pounds, but for women watching, I'm talking about 360 pounds because statistically, that's the same. 13.7% of competitive powerlifters can hit those numbers for both men and women. So continue watching and I'm going to give you these tips. The only other caveat I'm giving is I'm talking about people under 60 years old and who are healthy without chronic injury, illness, conditions that would prevent them from making the same progress as other people in the deadlift. Now, I'm going to give you the 4 key areas that you need to improve and that usually fall apart when it comes to building a big deadlift. But if you want more extensive help along with the program, I have linked my programs down in the description below. Now, the 4 areas I'm going to go over today are core strength, your leg strength required to deadlift big weight, the patience and programming required to be able to lift big weight and deadlift big weight, and now, to the number one reason people don't deadlift what they could, and the number one reason deadlifts fall apart, it is a weak core. Now, deadlift is the number one core exercise when they do intramuscular EMG. So since it stimulates the core the most, wouldn't you figure that all you should do is deadlift more and you should increase your core strength? To be honest, I used to think this for a long time, but I've come to realize that you can deadlift big weight without having the strongest core. It can be the weak link in the chain. And we can identify how it's a weak link in the chain. The number one way we would identify that is a rounded back off of the floor. The reason that this is an adaptation that we have is because it decreases the moment arm between our shoulders and our hips. And moment arm is essentially the leverage by which we use to lift any weight. The second year university way of explaining this is if you were to push a door at the hinges versus a door at the end, of course, pushing the door at the end is going to be much, much stronger. And effectively, that's what we're doing by bringing our hips and our shoulders closer together. We're bringing the line of action of our force and the area by which the force needs to be exerted as close together as possible, meaning that we have a mechanical advantage. The number 2 way we can identify a weak core in the deadlift is difficult lifting from knee to mid-thigh. This is not a different statement to the last one. It's partially, if you round your back, you're eventually going to have to unround your back in the second half of the lift. But more importantly, the first part of the deadlift, your core stays the exact same, or I should say your torso stays the exact same angle. Once it gets past your knees, when you need to start opening up your torso and you need to open like a book and stand tall, of course, to lock out the deadlift. If you have a weak core, it is still possible to bring your hips through, but then you're going to get stuck in that all too familiar position with the bar just above your knee and your back rounded as hell and you're trying to fight and fight and fight, but it's just not going anywhere. Well, if you had a stronger core and you were able to stiffen your back, ultimately you could deadlift more weight. And number 3 is if you're prone to low back pain when it comes to deadlifting. This is going to get to our core strength and how do we build core strength and intra-abdominal pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But if your core is weak, you're naturally going to be predisposed to predisposed to low back pain. This is because we have 3 layers of protection when it comes to our core and deadlifting in our low back. Number 1 is going to be your ability to create intra-abdominal pressure. A stronger core means more intra-abdominal pressure. Number 2 is going to be our spinal erectors, our muscular resistance to folding over. Of course, this is going to have natural limitations. And number 3 is relying on our soft tissues. And there are a lot of people who rely on the soft tissues of their low back to transfer the force from the legs to the shoulders. And this is the thing you have to understand most about the core. Its job is to translate the force you put through your legs into your shoulders. The reason that we can't deadlift as much as we leg press is because our core is the weak link in the chain, and it will likely continue to be that way. Of course, we also have that the bar is loaded out in front of us. There is more than just that. But if our core was absolute rock solid and there was no wavering and no difficulty whatsoever, well, you would be able to deadlift maybe 70% of what you could leg press. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what that ratio should be. But the point is, if you strengthen your core, you will be able to absolutely blow your lifts out of the water. Now, how do we strengthen your core for deadlifts? We can't just have a do-it-all approach, and a generally strong core means a very strong deadlift. We're not going to be doing med ball twists and pal-off presses and general core strengthening exercises specifically for the deadlift. we need to focus on increasing our ability to generate intra-abdominal pressure. This is how we deadlift big weight. This is how we keep our back safe. Now, there are 3 reasons why your intra-abdominal pressure might not be good enough, and we can sort of see what happens when these are incorrect. Number 1 is our pelvic floor. And our pelvic floor, which creates the bottom of the canister by which we create intra-abdominal pressure, you know that this is a problem if there is any sort of urination happening. This is not normal and this is not healthy. This is something that should be assessed by a pelvic floor physio. And I say this with the utmost sympathy for everyone that this happens to. It doesn't have to happen. You absolutely can rectify this problem. And not only will you not wet yourself, you will also be stronger for it. Number 2 is your diaphragm. If we don't contract our diaphragm, there's going to be no brace at all. And it's not hard to do. We just have to learn to breathe into our stomach. The easiest drill that I use is 1 hand on the chest and 1 hand on the stomach. Get that stomach hand moving, and that is your diaphragm breathing. The other way by which we breathe is contracting our intercostal muscles, our ribs flare, and our lungs expand outwards. If we can get our diaphragm contracting, we're on the way to having strong intra-abdominal pressure. And number 3 is if your core is weak. Now, it is a natural question. If we're pushing our core out and we're compressing from the top, compressing from the bottom, we push out. Well, muscles can only contract. So if we contract all of our core musculature, you would think that that brings everything back in. And that's sort of true, but the activity of our diaphragm and activity of the pelvic floor is going to mean everything is pushed outward. After that, we lock it in by contracting hard with our core and creating a very, very stiff, hard canister-like area between the bottom of our rib cage and our pelvis. If you don't contract your core, all you're doing is pushing out this fat blob looking of a stomach. It's not a cute thing. It's not something we want to be doing to be aesthetically pleasing, but that's all you're doing if you're not contracting your core. You got to push out with your diaphragm contraction, push everything out, contract hard. A belt is useful, and then you're going to be able to use your core effectively. One quick note on belt before we move to part number 2, leg strength. The belt actually increases your intra-abdominal pressure and increases your core activity. Omitting the belts to create a natural weak link in the chain makes very little sense unless you're trying to protect the nervous system for a short period of time. But omitting the belt in order to increase core strength is something that I do not support based on the evidence. Now let's move on to number 2, talking about leg strength. Leg strength is probably the most overlooked thing when it comes to deadlifting well. Really, off the floor, it can be accurately described that a deadlift is just a leg press. Now, the cue of don't use your back is of course nonsense. You're going to have to use your back when it comes to deadlifting, but an over-reliance on your back and an omission of your legs is going to leave you very weak off the floor and put way more load on your core, as we talked about in number 1, and really leave a lot on the table for what you could possibly deadlift. Let's talk about how to know if you're using too much back when it comes to the deadlift. First of all, the general question when we are exercising and saying, what are you working, is what do you feel the next day? Your low back can be sore, and that's totally fine. Your spinal erectors are working very hard when it comes to deadlifting, but are your quads sore? Are your hamstrings sore? Do you feel systemically fatigued? If you feel fresh, your legs feel fresh, and your low back is painful, well, this is a cardinal sign and a very obvious sign that you're using too much back when it comes to your lift. Number 2, reason that your back might be sore, or you might be over-relying on your back when you're deadlifting, is that your hips shoot up immediately when you go to lift. Mechanically, this gets your legs out of the movement and just allows you to pull entirely with your back. Often this is coupled with a rounding of the back, and it's just an all-up bad idea to try to deadlift heavy this way, but all too common. I believe the number 1 accessory exercise for deadlifts is squats because they mimic the deadlift so closely in terms of the muscles used. It's actually shocking when they do studies on the activity of musculature during different lifts, how similar that they can be. I've created some very rough guidelines when I was making this video on where should your squat be and where should your leg press be in relation to your deadlift. So your leg press run to max should be a minimum of 2 times your max deadlift. So if we're trying to deadlift 600 pounds, your leg press should be at least 1,200 pounds. And this is not with wraps. This is just normally with sleeves. with reasonable range of motion, 1,200 pounds. For your squats, it should be a minimum of 2/3 of your max deadlift. If we're trying to deadlift 600 pounds, this means your squat should be at least 400 pounds. This depends a lot on the length of your femurs. It depends on body proportions altogether. That being said, we can have a reasonable assumption that if you can't squat 400 pounds, you probably don't have business trying to deadlift 600 pounds. And ultimately, if the goal is just, or the problem is just getting your legs stronger, there are so many ways to rectify this problem. And again, I have a program down for your legs below if this is your problem. Now, fun fact, some people have such strong, powerful legs, they can absolutely blast the weight off the floor straight to lockout without really exposing the weakness in the second half of the lift until it gets to extremely heavy weight. The best example I have of this is professional strongman and world-class deadlifter Evan Singleton, who's pulled 900 plus pounds without a suit on by essentially blasting the weight off the floor and fighting like hell above the knee. You can get rid of a weakness in the top half by explosion in the first half, but you can't get rid of weakness in the first half by having a very strong second half of the lift. So strong legs are going to be absolutely vital when it comes to deadlifting massive weights. Part number 3 is technique. I do put technique as number 3 because the human body has this incredible ability to adapt and improve and refine if you expose yourself to things over time. So if you are deadlifting for months and months and months and you're doing it safely, your technique will tend towards a more advantageous style so long as you continue some minor exploration, and you will get to a better place. But at a certain point, you do need a little bit of advice and a little bit of help when it comes to your technique. So understanding how to remedy common problems is where I guide people most often. And don't overcomplicate the technique, because you're going to start to think more about the technique than the aggression required to deadlift heavy. So I'm going to keep it really short and sweet here. If you're weak off the floor, narrow your stance. If you're weak off the ground, widen your stance. If your hips shoot up immediately, the bar is too far in front of you. And if you have no power off the floor, the bar is too close to you. Last, if your shins aren't cut up, lift the bar closer. Rectify those common problems. Practice deadlifts often. Use accessories, which we're going to talk about in a second, and variations to be able to refine this lift. And you should be able to make really good progress over the long run. Don't overcomplicate your life. Focus on one cue at a time for setup, one cue at a time for your lift, and you will make good, steady progress on your movement quality over time. Now, part number 4 is, of course, patience and programming. If you made it this far in the video, you clearly have patience, and please subscribe if you're getting usefulness from my conversations. Now, strength doesn't come quickly for anyone. It's said that I was an overnight success and I won World's Strongest Man out of nowhere. And look, I took up strongman 2 years before winning World's Strongest Man, but I had 10 years of lifting heavy before I took up strongman. It was a very long journey to build a base to become very, very strong. So you have to have patience yourself. When I say anyone can deadlift 600 pounds, if you're sitting here saying, well, no, not me, you need to be consistent for 5 to 10 years before you can say something is possible or not possible for you. And you know what? In that 5 or 10 years, before you say it's possible or not possible, you're going to accomplish some incredible things in the interim. Now, when it comes to programming, let's talk about frequency first. Deadlifting more than once a week is impossible for most people. It is a sympathetic overload. It is so taxing on the body, and deadlifting more than once per week is going to be a very big challenge for most people, but we can work around this because leg work can be done 2 to 3 times a week for most people. And like I said earlier, leg strength is one of the key principles of deadlifting big weights. When it comes to intensity, this is probably not what you think. We need to reserve maximum efforts for once every 8 weeks at least. Most of your work should be done in the 7, 8 out of 10 range, a little bit in the 9 out of 10 range. But again, we're training the nervous system, not the muscles, so we don't want to be going to maximum effort. We want a stimulus. We want to be working generally hard, but we don't want to be working to maximum. When it comes to the type of exercise, we want to focus on deadlift variations, not deadlift accessories. A variation is taking the movement and modifying it slightly to expose something. An accessory is something that will work similar muscles. So a pause deadlift is a variation. A back extension is an accessory. I love back extensions, you guys know that, but deadlift variations are going to be key to deadlift big weight. The top 3 for me to improve my deadlift have been snatch grip deadlifts, pause deadlifts off the floor, and speed reps. Using those has absolutely helped me lift more weight in the long run. Now, one additional caveat that I didn't give at the beginning that is not required but is useful is body weight. Overall, if you can deadlift 600 pounds, and this is the same for women at 360, if you can deadlift 600 pounds as a man in powerlifting all time, this would put you at 41,344 out of approximately 300,000, and this puts you in the top 13.7%, as I said at the outset. If you're under 183 pounds, you would be in the top 4,172 out of 84,000, which would put you in the top 5%. If you're over 264 pounds, if you deadlift 600 pounds, you are 10,545th out of 27,000, meaning that you're in the top 39%. Ultimately, weight moves weight, and you're going to have to put on some mass if you're a small person in order to lift this much, but the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of physiology do not omit anyone. You can add weight, you can add muscle, you can add size, regardless of who you are. How much effort that takes might just vary from person to person. Now, you can become bigger, you can become stronger, you can attack both at the same time. Again, all of those options in my programs are linked down in the description and in the pinned comment. Whether you get those or not, whether you go to my free resources or not, I hope this video gave you a really good idea of how to deadlift big weight and hopefully a little bit of inspiration on how you could hit your first 600-pound deadlift. Thank you very much for watching. Comment down below your biggest takeaway from this video, and please subscribe. It is free and it helps tremendously. Until next time, lift heavy, be kind, and we'll catch you tomorrow.